Welcome back to my disembodied voice. Now, in the MCU, nobody had a better character arc from selfish playboy to world-saving hero than Tony Stark. Whether or not he was your favourite character, and whether you were Team Cap or Team Iron Man in Civil War, at the end of the day, Robert Downey Jr. nailed the hero's journey and gave us all a tear-jerking farewell when he stood up and gave his life in the only ever outcome that was destined to stop Thanos. So, as I sometimes do on this channel, I thought I would honour this legend of the silver screen with a clinical case study into how he went from selfish weapons maker to billionaire playboy philanthropist to tormented and guilt-ridden existential crisis to standing up when he needed to be counted and stopping the mad tyrant once and for all. So, for today's video, join me as we look at Tony Stark from Iron Man 1 all the way to Avengers Endgame and look at what makes up his character. Oh, and spoilers ahoy for any film that had Iron Man in, and, to ensure full coverage, spoilers ahoy for the MCU phases 1 to 4. Now, as ever, we'll be following a flow-through chart, and as this is a clinical case study, we'll be looking at what makes Tony tick through his history, his personality, his biology, and look at how all those things made him such a legend. So, our chart for today is narcissism, adversity, PTSD, paranoia and guilt, full circle. Right then, let's crack on. Now, before we start, we need a little history about Tony Stark to set up the person we meet in the first Iron Man. Tony was a child genius and quite the precocious talent. He was building engines and circuits when most children were learning how to stick down bits of coloured paper and, be it cracking the Pentagon firewall or merely outshining everyone else in MIT, Tony was quite the child prodigy. However, raised by his butler and aloof from his natural father, we already have some of the building blocks in place for the developmental problems that lead to emotionally unstable personality disorder, or borderline personality disorder if you're from other parts of the world. Now, Tony doesn't have emotionally unstable personality disorder, but early on in his life, the detached parents, the genius presentation, meant he was isolated from others and living inside his own world, and that created interpersonal deficits and also some very crucial psychodynamic deficits. Now, personality disorder expert Theodore Millen put forward that to make a personality disorder, one needs to have significant impacts in childhood before the diagnosis can be made, where we have 3 major factors of interpersonal, biological, psychodynamic. So, as interpersonal deals with how we form relationships with others, biological is affected by, well, many things, but mostly including brain formation, our endocrine system, and how our physical interaction with the world alters our brain chemistry. And of course, psychodynamic is about how feelings and experiences, often stemming from childhood, influence our current behaviours and our mental health and our functioning in the world. Now, Tony has had a privileged but unusual childhood. Far ahead of his schoolyard friends, distant from his parents, and not interested in the kind of tasks that would be more age appropriate, Tony's frame of reference and phenomenal field of reality become very subjectively distorted and dominated by his ego. Now, let's quickly divert and take a look at another childhood genius, the serial killer Alice Morgan in the TV show Luther. In Luther Series 1, when Alice details her childhood to Luther, she talks about being a teenager who was growing up around adults and generally older men when she was just turning into puberty because she was so clever she was acing adult exams when she should have been coming out of primary school. Luther challenges Alice and she talks about how she matured sexually and very quickly, and how she grew up very quickly too. However, she was still a freak of nature, and she was still a child, and her personality was then formed into something called malignant narcissism, and that was formed by being a genius and getting nothing but praise. And, like her, Tony doesn't necessarily have a personality disorder which is emotionally unstable. Instead, he has a personality that's filled with narcissism, a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, a need for admiration, and a lack of empathy, and a grandiose sense of self-importance, as well as a belief in one's uniqueness and specialness. Now, Tony is special, clever, and gifted, but all of that praise and talent warps him as he lives inside his own ego bubble, and he's either doing amazing things, or being praised for amazing things, or just generally being amazing and wonderful. Except the one person Tony Stark craves attention from doesn't give it to him, and that's his father. So Tony has a talent and is worthy of praise, but without the guardrails of parental reinforcement and nurturing love so he can build a sense of genuine stability and modesty, he defaults to the very defense mechanism of narcissistic personality disorder, and that's rationalization. People with narcissistic personality disorder create logical or seemingly justifiable reasons to explain their behaviours, actions, or feelings, even if those reasons are not accurate or self-serving. So Tony justifies his actions to avoid excuses, avoid criticism by offering seemingly reasonable explanations that minimise other people's flaws or his own, and generally reduce any negative impact on himself, and he maintains a lofty self-image and then denies reality itself. In the original Iron Man, Tony is what the Americans call a douchebag. He sleeps with hot women for fun, although narcissists don't actually really have sex, they sort of masturbate with someone else's body. Anyway, Tony is masturbating with other women's bodies, taunts those who are lesser than him, and even in a war zone when showing his bombs off, he treats the whole reality of war and suffering as a joke and merely maintains himself as the centre of attention and some kind of wonderful celebrity that everyone admires. Narcissists need a constant thing called narcissistic supply, and that's attention, praise, adoration, no matter who from or where you are. Basically, even when he's in the desert showing off weapons to soldiers, it's love me, I'm a celebrity, worship me, yeah, throw it up there, selfies, you name it. He loves it. Coming back to narcissistic personality disorder, Theodore Millen argued that there were classifications of narcissists, and these were the unprincipled narcissist, exploitative, manipulative, a liar, a cheater, unethical, arrogant, and a dominator. The amorous narcissist, flirty, seductive behaviours, hypnotic and charming demeanour, seduces for financial or status advantage, serial cheater, incapable of intimacy. The elitist narcissist, snobby, a belief in superiority due to family, wealth and connections, obsession with social status, labels and exclusivity, social climbers or actively well placed in elite circles. The compensatory narcissist, deep-seated insecurity and inferiority, external grandiosity to mask inner insecurity, delusions of grandeur without real achievements. But those don't really fit Tony, because Tony is what is known as the variant of pure pattern, and that is a normal narcissist. Performative empathy, desire for control, mild manipulation and invalidation, often perceived as a jerk or an a-hole. Tony may have been made this way via parental over-evaluation, excessive idealisation from others, entitlement, lack of realistic feedback to his ego, a distorted self-perception and a large over-evaluation of himself, but When the convoy is shelled in Iron Man 1 and he is severely hurt, we see how the narcissist genuinely is behind those eyes in times of crisis, and that's just a scared little boy. Made of flesh and blood like the rest of us, Tony is no longer being idolised and living in his billionaire mansion with his many symbols of his narcissism, the classic cars, the top-of-the-range furniture, robotic toys and hot girlfriends, and suddenly he's little more than a slave in a cave. This is Tony's first stage into becoming both Iron Man and a hero, as the environment harshens and all the bravado means nothing, and he faces his own mortality against people who are going to torture him and ultimately kill him. More so, now he has a piece of shrapnel heading for his heart, he creates something called an arc reactor, which is both a magnet and a power source that helps keep him alive. Tony is immediately humbled both by his mortality and now living as a slave and seeing the damage his weapons are doing, and this causes the epiphany of change that starts his hero's journey. And the hero's journey is all about undergoing a trial, being changed by it, and emerging post-ordeal as a new man. Now, in the original Iron Man, Tony Stark is living the life we'd all like to live, but as the film makes a point with his spare arc reactor at the end of the movie, Tony Stark does indeed have a heart, and although narcissistic and crass, his brush with death and abuse from his captors changes him, and the catalyst for that change is adversity, a difficult or unpleasant situation which requires fortitude and belief to endure, and an ordeal which builds character when the challenge is finally surmounted. Now, standing before the loss of his own existence and aware he will never be let out of the cave because the terrorists would rather kill him than set him free, he uses his intellect to survive. His genius keeps him alive, but so does something else. Playing a game of social compliance and chicanery with his captors so they think he is doing something for them, i.e. building a weapon, and this is where his narcissism starts to break down as he has to contrast acting subserviently whilst staying alive long enough to forge his own escape, and that takes skill, cunning, and an understanding of how others feel by using cognitive and effective empathy for the first time in his life. Now, adversity builds character and makes us stronger as we learn from ordeals and build that resilience. And individual resilience is closely related to our personal sense of security or how comfortable we feel about ourselves. The more stable we are psychologically, the more we can tolerate the stresses of the outside world. Resilient people don't avoid life's hard knocks. They bounce back and flourish and actively seek out new challenges. It builds entire new structures in the brain's neuroplasticity. So Tony escapes the cave and starts to treat people better. In Iron Man 2, he lets Rhodey in a little bit closer and even lets him have a suit, and by the time of the Avengers, his ordeal in the cave means that, despite not playing well with others, he is already expecting the worst in people and organisations, but is also ready to work with them, cheat their systems, keeping his little traits of narcissism, but doing what needs to be done to work in a team and protect the Earth, because Tony knows that the world is no longer all about him, it's about others, and the world needs to be there if he's to enjoy living in it. The ego is kind of flipped. It's not all about him and the world revolves around him. He is a piece in the world now, and he wants to help the world. The hero is now already formed, but what he now needs to do is work in a team, and as the Avengers don't initially like each other when they meet, the adversity of bonding with this team, nearly being killed by Loki, and seeing the Hulk nearly kill everyone, focuses him into the inevitable teamwork. Adversity causes epiphanies and builds character, and whether becoming a superhero or joining the Avengers or just becoming a better self on his personal journey, the psychological changes that surviving adversity brings means that Tony's brain plasticity changes and his personality alters, and he now has feedback from peers he respects or challenge him. And he isn't locked in his own ego bubble because he now needs the Avengers as much as they need him. And oddly enough, he has a deep sense of adoration for Bruce Banner, who he sees as a near intellectual equal and somebody who has their own personal demons. And although Banner is trying to stop a monster from ripping the team apart, Stark has a genuine love and adoration for him, and unlike Cap and Thor, he never really argues with Bruce or doubts him, even in some of the darkest times. However, at the end of the first Avengers, Tony nearly dies again, and after carrying a nuclear weapon through a wormhole, he develops PTSD. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a mental health condition which develops after enduring or witnessing a traumatic event and causes hyperarousal, paranoia, intrusive thoughts, and negative feelings. By the time of Iron Man 3, Tony is having panic attacks and struggling with his life. Much like himself, almost as a mirror representation, his suits are falling apart and a collection of pieces that don't quite fit right and keep shattering or struggling to cohesively form. Like I said, a representation of Tony's brain at the exact same time. PTSD is developed after a traumatic experience. These can include, but are not limited to, violence and war, witnessing an assault, childbirth, being bullied, being involved in a road traffic accident or a natural disaster, or suffering a severe assault. For Tony, it's flying into that wormhole and nearly dying. Now, symptoms of PTSD include having traumatic memories or dreams, avoiding things that remind you of the event, not being able to sleep and feeling anxious, and you also feel isolated and withdrawn. Tony has panic attacks at various moments in Iron Man 3 and is unable to sleep and is a far cry from the cocky, arrogant man who blazed his way through the first two films and the Avengers. Now, whilst I personally hated Iron Man 3 for botching the Mandarin and spending way too long on poorly executed humour, his PTSD is represented very well in the movie. So, how has Tony's brain been affected by PTSD? Let's take a look. PTSD significantly affects the amygdala, the centre for fight or flight response, the hippocampus, the memory centre of the brain, and the prefrontal cortex, the executive functions like planning, decision making, working memory, and self-regulation. And these things being affected means that we have hyperactivation of the amygdala, so extreme fight or flight, reduced hippocampus volume, we can't remember past events or how we coped with things, and decreased prefrontal cortex activity, respectively, which means our kind of regulation, planning, decision making doesn't fit in, and everything's overwhelmed by the panic station of the amygdala and limbic system. And these changes can result in exaggerated fear responses, memory difficulties, and impaired emotional regulation and reliving of previous experiences. Now, with working memory affected, this may also be another reason why the suits in Iron Man 3 are a bit rubbish, because Tony is making mistakes. His mind is cluttered and he isn't able to make them like he did in the original Avengers when they stood up to Thor's lightning and could take on anything. Anyway, let's look at the brain areas mentioned above and see how they are affected by PTSD in more detail. The amygdala. The amygdala becomes hyperactive in PTSD. This leads to an overreaction to perceived threats, contributing to anxiety, hypervigilance, and an increased startle response. Remember that scene in Iron Man 3 where Tony is panicking? He goes to his suit and he asks his suit to check the heart, check the brain. He flips on a dime and goes from okay to complete meltdown. Hippocampus. The hippocampus, crucial for memory formation and emotional processing, shrinks in people with PTSD. This can affect the ability to process and integrate traumatic memories, leading to flashbacks and nightmares. Tony hasn't processed the events of the Avengers, has nightmares, and again, his memory and coping skills are being affected when making his suits or living his everyday life. Even when he gives his address out to the Mandarin, which is a silly plot twist as everyone would know where Tony Stark lived, the point is that he's not thinking rationally and his memory isn't kicking in and he's putting himself in danger without realising it. The prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for decision making and emotional regulation, has reduced activity in PTSD. This can contribute to difficulty controlling emotions and impulses. Research also points to changes in other brain areas such as the cerebellum and the mid-anterior cingulate cortex. The cerebellum is involved in motor skills, balance and emotions, and may show reduced white and grey matter during periods of PTSD, and the mid-anterior cingulate cortex, which plays a role in emotional awareness and pain perception, is also affected, and therefore, once again, everything goes into flux and the limbic system takes over, and people are far from who they used to be. Now, by the time we reach Age of Ultron, we are in paranoia and Tony is worried about the threat returning and wants a suit of armour around the world. However, he has made peace with the past a little, and by removing the shrapnel and seemingly casting the past into the ocean and blowing up his suits, which may have been down to Robert Downey Jr.'s contract being up at the time and the cost of him returning to the MCU was not straightforward. Anyway, nonetheless, we hit Age of Ultron and he accidentally creates the thing he dreads when he makes a vibranium murder bot by messing with Loki's scepter. Now, Age of Ultron is not a great movie, but it does end with the Battle of Sokovia, and this creates the scenario which leads to many deaths and Tony's battle in Civil War, both personal and with Captain America, which is paranoia and guilt. Negative feelings of distress and unhappiness stemming from a negative event or outcome of which the person feels responsible for. By the time of Civil War, Tony is racked with guilt and can see the need for the Avengers to be put in some form of check and order as the only way to make up for all those poor civilians who died in either the Battle of New York or Sokovia. By now, Tony is just going over and over things, and this reprocessing of the past and internalizing the negative side only activates areas of the brain such as the left anterior insula, involved in emotional awareness, the left temporoparietal junction, social cognition, and the amygdala, which again fires off our threat response. And the frontal lobe, which is involved in not only decision making, but regulating all the emotive soup from the amygdala and the limbic system. Tony is a wreck in Civil War, and his entire thought pattern of fighting the Avengers and falling deeper into guilt is shown in a physical way as, for much of Civil War, Tony has a very prominent bruise on his face. This bruise is about the physical representation of his emotional scars and the guilt that these are weighing him down with. And this carries into Infinity War when, upon hearing of Thanos and the oncoming war, all that negative self-esteem, depression, anxiety, guilt, and paranoia return, but unlike in Iron Man 3, Tony actively goes to the fight, again showing signs of his strength from adversity, and places himself on Ebony Maw's spaceship and goes to face this destiny once and for all and protect the ones he loves. His fear and worry about Thanos leads him into a one-way trip to Titan and trying to save Doctor Strange. Upon hearing Bruce Banner's ominous threat of what's coming, his worst fears are suddenly realised. He feels vindicated by his long time ago guessing that the world needed a suit of armour around it and his paranoia was justified and the apocalypse was coming, and he reacts and goes straight to the spaceship. However, after the Infinity War and nearly dying in space, he is rescued by Captain Marvel in Endgame, and once the anger subsides and he heals his body, he makes peace with Steve Rogers and uses his brain to build the new gauntlet and time travel devices like he built the suit in Iron Man 1, which helped him escape, and this leads to the final assault on beating Thanos once and for all. Now, we're coming full circle to Iron Man 1 here, where he's fighting to escape the terrorists and using his wits and his brain to fully survive, and this leads to the final part of the arc in Endgame, which is full circle. Tony Stark's character arc ends when he makes the ultimate sacrifice to save the world, and the once narcissistic and selfish playboy gives his life to save the whole universe. Tony's entire personality and experience have moulded him into who he is, and when the time comes, he realises that he is the one chance in over 14 million and snaps Thanos to dust at the expense of killing himself. By this point in the story, Tony is married to Pepper and he has a daughter, and he's made many peace with his friends, and he's also mentored Peter Parker, who's now been brought back with the snap, into being a hero. He's made peace with the past, built the time travel navigation bracelets, and his last act is to give his life and save the world. He starts out as realising he can be a hero by seeing the horror of what his weapons have done and using Iron Man for good, but by the end of Avengers Endgame, he uses his Iron Man suit to snatch the Infinity Stones and banish Thanos, even though his suit is never going to protect him from the sheer energy and power that those stones give him. Tony Stark indeed has a heart. The man who felt unloved became a narcissist because he wanted attention from the world that his father never gave to him and helped him blot out the pain of being a product genius child. And the man who helped build the Avengers saves everyone. In Avengers Endgame time travel sequences, he even meets his father in the past, and this helps him make a sort of peace with all the negative assumptions he had held about his father. Basically, he sorts out his past, kind of makes up with his dad, saves the universe, and dies having had the family of his own that he needed to anchor him into maturity, as he was always going to end up this way, and he always had a heart. Tony knew that whatever was coming from space was going to kill everyone, but eventually, as time passed and he suffered loss and epiphanies and all the things we've talked about, he grew and matured through adversity and the character's journey. Tony Stark went through everything, and he was made better by life, errors, redemption, trauma, trials, guilt, recovery, and his brave, selfless actions. He went from selfish to selfless, and from vicariously killing people with his weapons, he saved the world with his best one of all, the Iron Man suit. It was a truly devastating end for such a great character, and one the MCU has struggled to replicate. Tony Stark went through it all, and hopefully this explanation of his hero's journey, mental processes and psychology and clinical study has helped you understand how he prospered and became who he was. Anyway, that's it for this week's video. So remember that psychology is cool. Please like, share and subscribe, as more subs means more vids, and even leave a comment or start a discussion, as healthy debate is always welcome on here. And as ever, until next time, I'll catch you later.
Sometimes I want to punch you in your perfect teeth.